Combs, who is 55 years old, could spend the rest of his life behind bars if convicted on sex trafficking and racketeering. He has pleaded not guilty.
She was a very credible witness.
And the judge in Sean Diddy Combs' sex trafficking trial finished Sean Diddy.
We're expected to hear from personal assistants and chefs, things like.
The courtroom fell silent as the judge uttered the words no one expected: life behind bars. Diddy's face twisted with disbelief. But what led to this shocking moment? Witness testimonies, hidden evidence, and a defense strategy that unraveled at the worst possible time. Stay tuned as we reveal how Diddy went from music mogul to facing a life-altering verdict, and the explosive courtroom drama that left everyone stunned.
He appeared to be looking for his family. They've pretty much been at all of the hearings that I've been to, but there was no presence of his sons or his mother or his sister who had previously been at those hearings. So here's what came out of today's hearing. Number one, the government acknowledged that they offered Combs a plea deal. Combs acknowledged he has no interest in taking that. They're going to move forward with the trial. They also talked about the jury selection process, which one legal expert I spoke to said is probably the most important thing that you want to pay close attention to before the actual trial starts. And thirdly, we learned that Combs will be adding 2 new attorneys to his defense team.
We're expected to hear from personal assistants and chefs, things like that, to Diddy, and whether or not they are sort of victims as well as co-conspirators. That'll be maybe a fine line to draw, but certainly with information about drug use. Remember, we heard about that potential arson, obstruction of justice. Remember, those are more of the elements involved in this racketeering conspiracy that the government really hasn't gotten on the table yet, and I would expect we would hear this.
Something that at first seemed insignificant, a casual mention during a federal investigation into unrelated financial crimes, was buried in paperwork, a peculiar note about a lavish event hosted by none other than Sean Diddy Combs. For most, his over-the-top parties were just another part of his flashy public persona. But for a handful of investigators, the case took a subtle turn. That note referenced names, payments, and attendees that didn't quite add up. Names that would later connect to charges far more serious than just tax discrepancies or financial irregularities. Diddy's public image since the 90s had been one of pure success, a hip-hop mogul, a forward-thinking producer, and an entrepreneur with an uncanny ability to dominate multiple industries at once. Yet these same traits, the boundless charisma that kept his empire alive, seemed to mask what investigators would later describe as something darker lurking beneath the surface: his infamous parties, celebrated for their exclusivity and attended by the who's who of Hollywood and music, weren't just known for champagne and networking anymore. Whispers circulated among entertainment insiders, murmurs that began to sound less like harmless gossip and more like breadcrumbs pointing toward larger, systemic secrets. The first tangible cracks in the glossy empire emerged as investigators uncovered digital communications, emails, texts, and financial transfers that seemed harmless on the surface. But when cross-checked with reports from paid informants, they began to show troubling patterns. Payments disguised as consulting fees raised eyebrows. Logistics hinted at a network that went far beyond simple gatherings, suggesting a system designed to move money, influence, and power quietly and efficiently. At first glance, it looked like it might just be about tax evasion. But those closest to the case couldn't ignore how these transactions aligned with certain names tied to organized activity. One particularly damning find was a ledger stored amid what was thought to be routine financial records. This document, straightforward in how it listed amounts and code names, made no direct reference to Diddy himself, but the coded transactions seemed curiously mapped to events and associates well within his sphere. Slowly, these findings began to point investigators toward allegations that diverged wildly from the public image Diddy had spent decades building. When whispers of these connections began to reach insiders, some spoke out, anonymously at first. Little by little, federal agents put the pieces together, linking testimony with evidence to uncover patterns suggesting deeper involvement. Finally, the tipping point came with a series of wiretapped conversations, where casual mentions of settling loose ends hinted at criminal workings running parallel to his public activities. At that moment, federal agents made the call to establish a formal investigation, but this was just the beginning. What followed, years later in the courtroom, turned these long-buried whispers into explosive evidence that no one could ignore.
Now it's looking more and more like that testimony will not be thrown out. Obviously, last week was all about the star witness, Cassie Ventura, star victim, I should say. She's victim number 1 in that government indictment. But the testimony from Dawn Richard was meant to corroborate some of Cassie's abuse. And part of that corroboration was an incident that she testified about when Diddy actually, she alleged, hit Cassie with a skillet. She was making eggs. He got, enraged and hit her with a skillet. Now, she also testified that thereafter, Diddy told her that people who spoke about these types of things tend to disappear, and that she took that as a threat on her life. The defense attorneys, rightfully so, objected to a lot of this testimony, saying much of it was hearsay. In trials, there are very strict rules of evidence. The judge is concerned that a lot of these now corroborating witnesses may be veering into hearsay, gossip. You only want witnesses to testify, and they're only allowed to testify to things that they directly saw or heard. So that's part of this objection, as well as this statement that Diddy apparently made to her. We're already seeing the defense today really try to get into those inconsistencies in Richard's testimony about whether did she actually witness this abuse or did she just see perhaps the aftermath of it. So that's kind of the issue here. The issue is the scope of the testimony. It does seem that the judge is going to allow that testimony to stand on Friday, but going into more of this testimony today, there may be a sort of a tighter scope around what they can testify.
The trial began with a sense of spectacle, but no one could have predicted how quickly the courtroom would descend into chaos. On one side, the prosecution came armed with years of evidence, volumes of financial records, wiretap transcripts, and a lineup of witnesses ready to testify. On the other, Diddy's legal team, one of the most expensive and high-profile groups ever assembled, appeared confident, brushing off the allegations as baseless conspiracies fueled by envy of his success. But the courtroom dynamic shifted almost immediately, and each day seemed to chip away at the defense's composure. The prosecution opened by presenting a former associate of Diddy's, a man whose testimony painted an unsettling picture of what went on behind the scenes. He described events that weren't the glamorous celebrations the public saw, but something far more calculated. Allegedly, these gatherings were more than extravagant parties. They were cover-ups for illegal operations that funneled money through shadowy channels. As he spoke, jurors leaned forward, listening intently as he recounted specific details: late-night meetings, coded instructions, and payments made in cash-filled envelopes. The prosecution reinforced his claims by immediately cross-referencing them with physical evidence, including a series of transaction logs found in Diddy's inner circle. But what truly silenced the room was the testimony from a former employee who had worked closely with Diddy for years. She described her role in managing his daily affairs, booking meetings, arranging events, and unknowingly facilitating what would later become known as financial fraud and conspiracy. One particularly damning moment came when she recounted an instance where Diddy explicitly told her to clean up the books after a large transfer was flagged internally. Her voice cracked as she read dates and figures directly from official records, documents that were later seized by federal agents. The courtroom reacted visibly. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the prosecution held up the actual ledger she referred to, pointing to a string of payments made to shell companies allegedly tied to an underground network operating under Diddy's name. The defense tried to strike this testimony as unreliable, but the employee's calm, detailed recollection left the jury with little doubt about her credibility. The trial wasn't just about numbers and transfers, though. Emotion poured into the room when a victim took the stand, shaking but resolute. They described feeling trapped in a system they couldn't escape, one controlled by Diddy's financial and social influence. Their words hung heavy, and for the first time, members of Diddy's team avoided eye contact with the jury, their earlier confidence visibly faltering. It was a witness's offhand remark that sealed the most dramatic moment so far. They mentioned a name, someone not previously linked to the case, which raised immediate questions about just how many people were involved. Suddenly, the defense team scrambled, requesting time to recalibrate their strategy. From that point onward, the prosecution gained an undeniable upper hand, leaving courtroom spectators stunned about what still might come.
Do have to say, obviously testified to years of abuse. The defense is already acknowledging that this was a domestic violence relationship. The question is, can the prosecution prove that this was sex trafficking, that this was a RICO conspiracy? So you'll see witnesses this week like Cassie's mother, her best friend of over 17 years, corroborating this information about the abuse. Now, the defense is saying, all right, there were instances of abuse, but how is that relevant necessarily to forced fraud or coercion relating to sex trafficking. So that's kind of what the argument is here. The defense is saying these are just bad acts witnesses. We call them bad acts witnesses because traditionally that type of testimony is not allowed in trials when that specific conduct isn't being charged. He's not being charged with domestic violence or assault in this case. So that will be an issue coming up. But I think it's all about corroboration this week.
Lucien Grange has been a very powerful figure for a very long time. Started as with a totally different name, by the way. I don't trust,
you're the one that put me on that rabbit hole.
I don't trust men that change their names, least of all 3 times, okay? A family that goes from Goldstein to G to Grange doesn't make sense to me. And you have him at the top of the food chain, heavily implied by Little Rod that they were allowing this to go on to get blackmail on certain people, and they just disappear him.
And I mean,
what's the logic here?
It's
no
understandable.
Evidence. There's tapes. Little Rod said there's nothing but tapes.
Tapes of everything.
And that Diddy was taping the people that were coming as well.
Yeah.
When he's mentioned in a Little Rod lawsuit as the fixer, to show you how extreme what he's being accused of is essentially he's the guy you call if you shoot somebody.
Yeah.
He intimates this scene in the lawsuit, Little Rod, where Diddy allegedly and his son allegedly shoot some guy in a bathroom. Little Rod is as this guy is bleeding out, cleaning up, trying to help this guy. He's very close or just outside of the bathroom. Little Rod might have been in the bathroom. And he knows that after Diddy and his son come up and shoot this guy, he's trying to apply pressure to the wound. And they know that you have to call this guy, and he'll get the correct person over at LAPD to come over, and they'll tell a lie. And he says that the next day the press ran a story that there was a drive-by shooting, and he's like, that's not what happened at all. And it made me really think about the book Chaos that so many people on my podcast have listened to and watched. I mean, I have listened to, and it's describing a corrupt LAPD with feds that are involved and know how to disappear certain things. And we know that to be factually true based on the Charles Manson murders.
At the start of the trial, Diddy's defense team exuded confidence. They brushed off the charges as exaggerated, painting the prosecution's case as a smear campaign aimed at tearing down a successful black entrepreneur. Their strategy was clear: discredit the witnesses, dismantle the allegations as circumstantial, and center Diddy's philanthropic efforts and clean public record. For the first few days, it seemed like they were holding their ground. They pushed hard against the character of several witnesses, suggesting ulterior motives and even financial incentives for their testimonies. In their opening statements, they cast Diddy as a larger-than-life figure unfairly targeted because of his wealth and influence, but cracks began to form when the prosecution unveiled evidence that the defense had either underestimated or didn't see coming at all. The turning point came when the prosecution brought forward a surprise witness. This individual, a longtime insider from Diddy's business ventures, testified under oath about internal operations that they claimed were designed to hide illicit activity behind legitimate contracts. As the witness recounted incriminating details about how funds were routed and accounted for, an audible shift could be felt in the room. The defense scrambled to object, questioning the reliability of the source, but the damage had already been done. What truly blindsided the defense, though, was the release of communications they hadn't been fully prepared to address. Text messages and emails, subpoenaed late in the investigation, highlighted conversations between key players on Diddy's team. One particular exchange was read aloud in court, a chilling reference to tying loose ends just before a key financial audit in 2018. The prosecution used this moment to argue that these weren't just sloppy mistakes in bookkeeping, they were deliberate efforts to conceal deeper wrongdoing. The defense initially tried to argue these messages were taken out of context, but their attempts to downplay the significance fell flat. Even the jury's body language seemed to shift, as several members were seen taking detailed notes during these exchanges. The weight of Diddy's persona heavily hung over the proceedings as well. For years, his image was carefully controlled, extravagant but generous, flashy but visionary. But as the prosecution painted him as the orchestrator of a web of illegal activities, that persona became a liability. The lavish lifestyle that once seemed aspirational now worked against him, underscoring the prosecution's narrative of unchecked power and influence. Jurors, many of them unfamiliar with the inner workings of the entertainment industry, were shown photos and videos from his infamous parties. It was hard to reconcile the billionaire mogul in designer suits with the mounting trail of evidence suggesting carefully planned covert operations. Throughout these moments, Diddy's composure visibly faltered. At times, he would tap his pen on the defense table, avoiding eye contact with the jury. On one occasion, as the prosecution presented yet another piece of evidence, he leaned into his lead attorney, a hand clasping his forehead, as if the weight of the trial was finally breaking through. It didn't help that his defense team began showing visible signs of strain as well. Mistakes, missteps, and moments of hesitation painted them as more reactive than proactive. The most notable blunder came during the cross-examination of a critical witness, when one of Diddy's attorneys misstated facts from earlier testimony, further eroding their credibility and drawing an objection from the prosecution that was swiftly sustained by the judge. By the middle of the trial, it was clear that the defense was treading water. Each new witness, each new piece of evidence, only solidified the prosecution's case, and their confidence had all but evaporated. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation for the judge's eventual verdict, but at that moment, it was painfully clear, Diddy's team had lost control of the narrative.
He's doing, is he running an entertainment and fashion industry, or is he running essentially a criminal organization?
By the way, we have a poll up right now. You can participate in it. Do you think Cassie Ventura was a victim or partner in this? Ready for this? 82%. Well, this doesn't make sense. 82% say yes. I don't know if that's yes to, I think we need clarification. 82% say victim or partner. We'll get a clarification on that.
By the way,
right now.
but that's my answer to that question.
Oh,
Was
okay.
he a victim or a
82%
partner?
say victim. 82% say victim. Maybe based on we're reporting on the testimony right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think she is a victim if the allegations are true, but also she is involved in some of the criminal I mean, she's getting those prostitutes, right? She's making payments to them, allegedly. She's having them come. So she's involved in some of the alleged criminal activity. And that's an interesting point that wouldn't just apply to her. Other people in his orbit might be some combination of victim and co-conspirator.
But you know what? That video changes everything, because the argument would be, what do you think happens if she says no?
Yeah.
What do you think happens if she says, I'm not in the mood for a freak off tonight. I'm not going to pay the dancer.
I'll be sure he came out saying that Kim Porter death needs to be looked into.
I think that Al being being his ex-wife, he have every right knowing about the stuff that came out about Diddy and what he was doing. You understand what he has done in the past, and people have overlooked it. By him coming out and saying that he hoped that he could get her case reopened. There was a guy called John the Paperwork Party. They would put in an open petition to get Kim's case reopened. You understand what I'm saying? So I'll be sure doing this is showing that, he still got love for Quincy's mother. He still want to find out the truth, because allegedly Kim was found the day before and the day of her death. And then now she found in the bed dead from pneumonia. That just don't sound right, bro. That don't sound right at all.
So you feel the same way about her death being suspect?
I don't think nobody in America thinks there's nothing suspicious about Kim's death, bro. If you are rich like that, you could, Kim had, I think a net worth of like, 12 million a year or something like that. Kim could have called any doctor to come over and look at her. If she was that bad, she could have called an ambulance or something like that. Everything is suspicious about her death, bro. And I don't think an autopsy was done on her. And if it was a half job.
You personally, right? What do you think happened to Kim Porter?
If I say something personal, bro, and my belief, and I put it on to the public, then I might be
like the courtroom buzzed with an almost unbearable tension as everyone took their seats on the day of the verdict. The energy in the room was thick, the kind of silence where even a pen drop could feel deafening. Diddy sat at the defense table, his head slightly tilted down, fingers tapping quietly against the armrest. The jury, having spent days deliberating on the fate of one of music's greatest moguls, appeared focused as they filed in, faces unreadable. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Months of damning testimonies and conflicting narratives had all led to this moment when the judge began speaking. The room felt as though it was holding its collective breath. Carefully, she outlined the charges that had been proven: financial fraud, conspiracy, and actions that prosecutors had repeatedly tied back to Diddy's leadership. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The judge paused for a moment, gazing across the courtroom before delivering the words that would define the rest of Diddy's life, a life sentence. The words landed like a thunderclap. Reporters seated in the gallery visibly jerked forward, some scribbling frantically, others muttering in disbelief. The murmurs didn't last long. Court officers immediately called for quiet. Diddy's reaction was almost surreal. He froze for a split second, visibly processing the impact of what he had just heard. Then, as if reality sunk in all at once, his expression shifted. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists, and he shook his head slowly. At one point, he leaned in to speak to his attorney, but whatever was said between them ended quickly. His face alternated between frustration and something deeper, perhaps disbelief that his power and influence couldn't shield him this time. Members of his family, seated nearby, displayed a range of emotions. A brother looked stoic, staring straight ahead. A cousin bowed her head, holding her hands together tightly. His mother appeared visibly shaken, her expression a mix of anger and sorrow. The judge didn't mince words in explaining the reasoning behind the decision. Referring directly to the trial's revelations, she noted the pervasive abuse of power and unapologetic manipulation of systems that Diddy had used to further his empire. She cited testimonies from individuals who had suffered under this system, calling Diddy's actions deliberate and harmful on a scale that couldn't be ignored. This was not a victimless crime, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. The prosecution nodded silently, their faces calm, but there was a faint sense of victory in their body language. Outside the courthouse, fans and detractors alike erupted. Social media flooded instantly with reactions ranging from heartbreak to resolve, with hashtags like #JusticeServed and #FreeDiddy trending simultaneously. And yet, this might just be the beginning. Lurking questions remain about who else in Diddy's inner circle could face charges. Many now wonder how much deeper this story could go. The courtroom may have delivered its verdict on the man, but the legacy of his empire, and the ripple effects of his downfall, are far from over. The fallout from Diddy's trial is sending shockwaves far beyond the courtroom. And it's not just about him anymore. Federal investigators have confirmed that they're expanding their focus, sifting through ties to other big names who may have been connected to the alleged network revealed during the trial. While no one has been officially charged yet, rumors swirling through industry circles are loud enough to raise eyebrows. And some notable figures are staying unusually quiet. Several leaks suggest that certain celebrities, many of whom were staples at Diddy's infamous gatherings, could face scrutiny. Names associated with his earlier ventures are reportedly being reviewed, and prosecutors are pushing hard to follow the money trails and communications unearthed during the initial investigation. Unverified reports claim that investigators are revisiting past financial collaborations involving record labels and event promoters, looking for discrepancies that mirror the alleged schemes tied to Diddy's empire. If even a fraction of the rumors prove true, the legal ramifications could be massive, leaving some of Hollywood's most untouchable stars in a very uncomfortable position. One insider account described a recurring pattern of how these connections worked. Allegedly, several high-profile figures were involved in deals that weren't entirely above board, often using middlemen to shield their identities. These deals reportedly funneled funds through companies based overseas or routed payments through third parties. Practices eerily similar to what was laid out in Diddy's trial. An anonymous source recently told journalists that this is just the tip of the iceberg, hinting at more revelations to come. Investigators reportedly believe there's a much larger, tightly woven network beneath the surface. And now, with Diddy's conviction, the door is wide open to start pulling the threads, but it's not just about money. The case has also reignited conversations about accountability within the entertainment industry. Many victims who have been quietly dealing with injustice finally feel emboldened to speak out. Fueled by the precedent set in Diddy's case, public reaction has been polarized. Some argue it's about time the music and entertainment industries are held to the same legal standards as everyone else. Others express shock that stars who seemed invincible are now facing real consequences. Still, some see this as a shift in culture, a moment where the line between fame and accountability is finally being enforced. No matter how big you are, the truth has a way of catching up, one observer commented, summing up the growing public sentiment online. The trial wasn't just about Diddy. It ripped open cracks in an entire system. And what happens next will depend on how much more investigators can uncover. For now, all eyes are on the ongoing probes. The big question, if Diddy's fall could shake the industry this hard, who, if anyone, might be next? The fall of Sean Diddy Combs marks a turning point for the entertainment industry, exposing cracks in the facade of untouchable celebrity power. This trial wasn't just about one man, it put a spotlight on accountability, power dynamics, and the systems that protect the elite. As investigations widen, the industry is left questioning how deep these networks run and who else might be implicated. It's a reminder that fame doesn't erase responsibility. What happens next could reshape not only careers, but the culture surrounding celebrity influence itself. One thing's certain, this story is far from over, and more revelations await.